So let's go and grab this leaf. And looking inside here, I'm going to close a bunch of stuff out because for translucency, obviously the translucency folder is important, but like I mentioned, refraction is as well. So this is something that if you've used translucency with a Blinn, a Phong, or an SSS material, this might seem a little odd. So on some levels, it kind of makes sense if you think about it. But what you want to do inside here is make sure that you get translucency but no transparency. So I don't want to be able to see through the leaves. I want them to be opaque yet translucent. So the way this works is obviously the first step is to turn translucency on. And then it has a color. The color that you put on translucency is basically your diffuse map. And so the diffuse map is going to go into color, but then you have a weight value. If the weight value is anything other than 1, so meaning anything like this, you're going to get a combination of translucency and transparency. So you'll be able to see through it, but it'll also have some translucency, kind of like frosted glass, for example. So in our case with our leaves, we want them to be opaque, so we'll put the weight value to 1. Then the transparency slider up here is going to control the amount of the SSS effect. So for leaves, the general range you're going to stay in is going to be around here, 0.1 to 0.4. And so let's say we put it to 0.25. So when blocking out your plant library, pretty much there's certain settings that you could use as a start point for, all of your leaves or anything that needs to be translucent. And that's where some of the settings I'm putting in here are just kind of start points. They're not necessarily right or wrong. They're just a good start point for a generic leaf that you can then go and adjust if you decide you want this leaf to be, more or less translucent or shiny or less shiny with the reflection settings. So since we have that value, let's go and get the color map in there. So let's go to Hypershade and let's go and map our shader. And so for it, let's go inside here. Let's just sort of move things around a little bit. So since we want our color map to be used for translucency, we can't go and put it directly in, again, because we have the issue of needing to gamma correct it. So we're going to need another gamma correction node. So what I'm going to do in here is under Maya, we can go and find our gamma correct node and stick that in there. So let's go and put that to value. And let's go and put the gamma to 0.454, 0.454, 0.454. So with this gamma correct node that we have inside here, the only thing though is like, well, this kind of seems a little bit redundant with having this one. Do I have to have a second one? You actually don't. So you could use the same one and output that into translucency. So the only thing is though, is that you can't go and take this as it is and put it into the translucency texture. And the reason is if your transparency is set to 0.25, knowing that you need a full weight value of 1 for this to be opaque, and there's a relationship between the two, the general rule is that you need to multiply the values of this map so that the transparency would become a value of 1. So it's a little weird. You just need to get used to the general workflow. And so what I would do is we can get rid of this gamma correct node. I'll create a multiply divide node, and so that's going to be right there. I'll output the gamma into input 1. So this is my texture. It's multiplied by a ramp for some color. It gets gamma corrected. Gamma corrected goes into diffuse. But then gamma corrected before it goes into translucency gets multiplied by 4. And the reason I'm using 4 is basically because my transparency is 0.25. So 0.25 times 4 equals 1. So that's basically the way you get translucency to work with the MIA material. And so now I can go and take this multiply divide node and plug that into, let's just go and shrink this down a little bit, and I can plug that into the color for my translucency. So this is now our network. So file multiplied by ramp for some color. It gets gamma corrected. The straight gamma corrected version goes into diffuse, but a version of the texture that's multiplied by 4 goes into the translucency. Weird, but that's how you have to do it. So that's the adjustment there. So now we're going to do it again for these leaves. Map that network. Let's go to that MIA material. Turn on use translucency. Put the weight value to 1. Put the transparency to 0.25. And then now create the multiply divide node. Tink, 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 there. Grab this, input 1, multiplied by input 2, which we're just entering values for, which is 4. And then that's going to get outputted as the color for translucency. And there you go. So now this is set up as well. But there's a very important thing that we still need to change on the shader for the translucency to work, which is whether for the leaves on the shrub or the rubber plant, under refraction is a folder called advanced refraction. And in here, you have choices between solid or thin walled. This is critical that you change this depending on the geometry. So for geometry like this, it's solid. It has thickness. So you would use this as solid if you were trying to make it translucent. The leaves, however, have no thickness. They are thin-walled. And so it's important for the translucency and the refraction to work correctly that you set that to thin-walled. So that's going to go for those leaves as well. So again, to make translucency work, you're using transparency. You're using translucency, set to a value or a weight of 1. You're putting your color map into color, but it's multiplied by 4. Or it's multiplied, rather, you could say it's 1 divided by whatever the transparency value is what you're going to multiply. So that's how you block out translucency. So we're going to do it a few more times over the course of the lecture when we move on to grass or if we move on to trees and leaves and all those kind of things. It's not the last time you're going to see me do this, but that's basically the workflow. So if we now close this out, and again, to check other things, we know that for these leaves, since they have no thickness, our reflection, skip reflection on inside, we turned off. We have our refraction. We have thin-walled. Translucency is on. We have our BRDF that we adjusted. We have our ambient occlusion that we chose to turn on. And for these leaves, importantly, under advanced, we have a cutout opacity, which is the out transparency of the file texture being flipped with the reverse utility. That's then being turned into a grayscale value or a float value that's then going into cutout opacity. So now let's go to render view and do another render. So give that a few seconds. And now things are looking a lot better. And so obviously once I go back to the previous render, it'll be a little bit more obvious. So this now finished. And you can see before and after. If you sort of look around the image, you're going to start seeing, for example, if you look at the bottom side of that leaf there, that it has some illumination to it. And so there is definitely light that's reaching the underside of the leaf. Although now we do get into an issue where there are other things that could be done to help with the way we're handling the render with render settings or final gather settings to make things look more believable. You also may feel that the reflectivity on here is maybe too high, or the glossiness is also a little bit too high. But let's go in with these leaves the way they are. And let's just sort of play with our light a little bit. So we'll save that render. I'm going to keyframe that light so we can save that position. But let's just try different light directions. So now that we have a backlit scene, so it'll become a little bit more apparent that the translucency is working. So you can see that on these leaves, the back side of the leaf is not dark or black. It actually has value or color to it because of the fact that it is using translucency for the render. So we're going to be getting a more believable render for those leaves, as well as inside here. So I'm going to go in, let's say to Final Gather. If we want things to look, potentially a little bit better, there's some changes we can make. We can go and, let's say, increase the filter by 1. This is always a good idea. I just tend to leave it at 1 all the time. If you do big renders, like 2K, 3K renders, you sometimes get artifacts, or I've had that issue with Final Gather, and putting the filter to 1 helps. Final Gather tracing, 2, 2, and 4 is a good start point for a lot of scenes, just so that it's tracing the Final Gather illumination a little bit deeper through the reflection and refractions, which in this case is also affecting translucency. We can add a secondary diffuse bounce, which really, really helps to get light into the nooks and crannies in your scene. And then under quality, I'm going to go and let's say render with Mitchell, which is the sharpest filter, which for stills is useful if you want a very, very sharp render. And then in here, I'm going to increase my refractions and my max trace depth. So especially in scenes where you have things that are transparency mapped, like we do with the leaves that are on the bush over here. So it's going to become important that you raise those values so that you get more light entering into the group or bunch of leaves. And I'll increase reflections as well. So we can get a couple reflection bounces, but we have 10 surfaces through which we can see our shadows and our refractions calculated. So with those changes, and then I can also increase my anti-aliasing, let's say to 2. The changes that I just made will cause the render to take a little bit longer, but we can evaluate if those changes are beneficial. So those are not things that I would use for test renders. It's just letting you know just some basic changes that can be made when you start approaching final rendering. And so obviously it's going to add a few seconds to the render time, but since we don't have a lot of geometry in here, it's not really a big deal. So, but I'm just going to pause the recording for a sec so you don't have to watch it. All right, so the render took about 3 times longer to render, but if I compare the previous render to this one, you should notice that the quality of the rendering that we're getting has improved. It's subtle, but there are certain areas that are important to notice where, let's say inside here, there's more bounce light entering that shadow. Or inside the bunch of leaves on this little shrub, you will also see that more light is penetrating into the group of leaves. So let's go in now. And I'm also going to throw real quick an MIA material on the floor. Just right now I think the floor still has just a default Lambert shader. So I'm going to go into Hypershade, go to Mental Ray, Material X. My ground is set to be reference, so let me select it. Come on. I just assigned this MIA Material X to it. And all I'm going to do is leave it pretty much at default. I'm just going to lower the glossiness on it, so it's just not very shiny. And I'm going to turn on ambient occlusion on it as well. So that's all I'm going to change on that. Maybe make it a little darker. And let's now try and do a render where we put the light from another angle. And just so that things are a little bit different, now that we've blocked things out a little bit, maybe I'll also go in and maybe we'll just sort of get more stuff in our render. So we have more plants to look at. And then there's our light. And let me go inside here. Now let's decide to first do one with the light up high. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. So we're going to do a couple of renders. I'll do a couple of renders. I'll pause so you don't have to watch them render, and then we can sort of see what kind of results we're getting. And I'm going to save my scene first. And let's now do some renders. All right, so I just did 3 different renders. And so we have 3 different lighting scenarios. And it allows us under different conditions to evaluate our shaders. So it's pretty important when you're designing shaders to check them, with the light coming from different directions. Just sort of you can evaluate how the specular highlights or translucency are working. And so hopefully you can see with just some, entering some generic values, we have something that's definitely looking a million times better than if we go all the way back. Whoop, not those renders, but here, where we just have the default Phong textures that were created by Paint Effects, where you can see these are looking very diffuse or matte. They're looking more like a Lambert shader than anything. So the lighting and the shading model that you're getting is not very realistic. So if we jump all the way to the last render, you can see this is now feeling much more plant-like. And so it's really, partly having to do with the MIA material just being much better at doing, glossy reflections and the way it thinks about specularity, as well as the translucency. So if we go, let's say this render, we can clearly see that the, top portion of the leaf versus the underside, that the translucency on these leaves is working very well. So that's pretty much how you make plant shaders or leaf shaders. So what other things might we want to talk about? Well, obviously, what would you adjust if you were looking at this and wanted to make some changes? The first thing might be how shiny are the leaves, and so that's going to be adjusting glossiness and the amount of reflectivity, right? So the glossiness, again, is how blurry this reflection is. So if I look at this rubber plant, now rubber plants are kind of waxy, so they are kind of shiny like this, but maybe the glossiness could be lowered a little bit because we're seeing the horizon line right there in this leaf, and you wouldn't really expect to see a horizon line reflected that clearly. And so that's where the glossiness setting on that leaf right now is at a value of what? Let's say we go and grab that leaf. So let me select it. Let's go back out here. So the glossiness is at 0.5 on that leaf. And so for that one, I might choose putting it to, let's say, 0.4, or 0.3, just to blur the reflection a little bit more. Then you might decide that the translucency on these is too strong or not strong enough. If these are supposed to be very, very dense, thick leaves, maybe they wouldn't be so bright on the underside. Well, then you would go in here under refraction, and you would lower the transparency value. So instead of 0.25, maybe we would try 0.15. So those are basically the dials that you're going to adjust. Other things that are going to help make this look a little bit more realistic are the fact that we are on all of our leaves right now using the same texture and the same shader on both the top and bottom side of each leaf. And clearly, if you grab any leaf outside and look at both sides of the leaf, the top and bottom sides are going to be different. So on some leaves, the bottom side is, let's say, not as shiny. It's a little bit more diffuse. Or maybe the bottom side of the leaf is a different kind of green. The top side might be more saturated than the bottom side, or the bottom side might be a little more yellow. So that's one thing to talk about is, how can we create a double-sided leaf shader, which for things that are going to be in the near ground might be a little bit more important. But even for things that are further away, it's going to create a nicer variety that looks a little bit more natural. Because when you do look at a tree or a bush, clearly you're seeing both the top and bottom sides of leaves. Then there's the issue of variety of leaf texture. Right now, this shrub is using the same leaf texture on every single leaf. And so another thing that could help would be a way to maybe have 4 different leaf textures that are sort of randomly being put on these different leaves. Couple ways to do that. You can adjust the UVs or offset the UVs on each of the polys for the leaves so that you could have a texture that instead of having a single leaf in it, maybe has multiple leaves in it. And so as an example, just so you know what I'm talking about. Let's say we just go and select these leaves. So if we go and take a look at the file texture that's on this guy, and let's see, that's going into the gamma correct node, and what's going into the gamma correct node is the ramp, which is, there we go. So there's the leaf texture. So if I view it, all right, just to make this point clear, I just opened Photoshop and opened what I was looking for. This is an example of what one of the brush images looks like that comes with Maya. So you can see it's an RGB A image. It's not very high resolution. It's 256 by 256. But if you're never going to get closer to a leaf than the size it is right here in your render, this would be fine. Well, here in Photoshop, I have an example of a texture that has 4 different leaves on it. And so for this one, you can see it's a little bit higher resolution. So you can see if I go into 100%, I'd be able to get a lot closer to these leaves. You would see obviously that there is an alpha channel that can be used for the cutout opacity. But with something like this, it would allow me to have my UVs on my leaves created so that each leaf is in a different quadrant. So we have 4 quadrants, right? So let's say 1 through 4, and each leaf has randomly been assigned a different quadrant to get its to place its UVs so that it gets a different leaf texture. So that's one way to randomize the leaves on, let's say, one of these paint effects bushes or even on a tree. So the specifics of how to do some of the things I'm talking about right now though, in regards to how to create a double-sided leaf shader, how to randomize the UVs for the leaves, we'll get into a little bit later. So right now I just want to stick with the basics. And then the last thing to mention as far as a way to randomize the look a little bit is just to use a procedural texture. That's the easiest thing. So that if we remember, this file texture is being multiplied by this ramp, which is giving it some color. But if instead of multiplying it by a ramp, let's say you multiplied it by a 3D texture, like a stucco, then you could randomize the color inside here. So since that's a relatively non-technical thing to do, let me just show you what I mean. So if we go to the shader for those leaves, and we go to Hypershade, and let's graph it. So we could still have this ramp in here that's changing the color, but we could just decide to sort of replace that with something else. And so meaning that instead of using that ramp, and again we know that the out color here is going to color gain and so forth. Well, let's say we either replace that, or what I'm going to do to make it easier, let's just go to our original file texture, go to color balance, and we could choose to multiply this by something else, which would randomize the color. Now granted, your start point is green, so if you start multiplying other colors by green, you're going to end up, as you can see inside here, if I start picking different colors, you can see the color you're going to end up getting. And so if I go into a green color, it's just going to get more green. But if I go to blue, I'm not going to get I'm going to get a very, very dark color. So that's where your start point leaf texture, you potentially would want to, let's just go and get this back to here, you would potentially want to, if you want to control the color with a solid texture or a 3D texture, you might want to reduce some of the, or remove some of the color that's inside here, which you could do by remapping the color. But just to make the point, I'm going to go in here to, let's say, color gain and map it, but I'm going to grab a 3D texture, meaning that this texture doesn't care about UVs, it just exists in 3D space. So if I grab something like a stucco, and I say, well, one of the colors is white, but one of the colors is maybe a little bit orange, maybe not super orange, but we can see the effect it's having in here. So some of the leaves are going to be a little bit more orangey, like they're a little bit older, for example. And let's go and maybe just make it a little bit more obvious there for the color. And then for the stucco, this is a relatively simple procedural. You can see you just have control for something called shaker. So you can see how it's controlling the fall off from one color to the other. But then very important with a 3D texture like this is you have an outliner, its little placement node pops up. So to adjust the scale of that stucco, you would scale this down or scale it up. But it exists in 3D world space. So if I were to go to my render view window now and do another render, let's say we'll just use the same light positions used for this one, we'll see that we're going to get some variation in color across the leaves. So this last render is saved, so let's do a new one. All right, so now you can see if you look at the shrubs and we compare with the previous render that we now have introduced a little bit of variety into the color inside that shrub. So very non-technical, very easy. So you can use a stucco or a fractal or a volume noise or whatever. The stucco is obviously just simple since it only has a couple, one slider to control it in two colors. So by making the color on that stucco white and orange, white is not going to change the leaf color because white is a value of 1, and 1 multiplied by anything doesn't change it. And so therefore, white leaves my green leaves, and then the orange is just making some of these leaves a little bit more brown as opposed to orange because we're multiplying orange by green. So looking at the image now, it's pretty much good to go other than some of the things we'll talk about later with the double-sided shader. But I'm happy with this as a start point. I might want to make more specific tweaks to these shrubs. So let's just do one quick thing. Let's say we decide I don't want those leaves to be so shiny. So what would I do? Well, I'm going to reduce the gloss on them a little bit. So let's say I'll put the gloss down to something like 0.2. Very blurry reflection on those leaves. And then let's say under the reflectivity for them, maybe I will lower the reflectivity at a glancing angle by 10%, a little more than 10%. And then on my rubber plant leaves, I also am going to reduce the glossiness down a little bit, maybe 0.4. But the brightness of the specular, I'll sort of leave the same. So I'm leaving the BRDF curve at 0.2 and 0.9. So the only thing I've changed is the glossiness from 0.5 to 0.4. So with those changes, let's do another render. So let's save and compare what happens. All right, so in here, if we compare with the changes we made, so you can see it's a pretty big difference. If we first start with the rubber plant, if we just look in the sort of reflection that's right here on this leaf and we compare before and after, changing the gloss from 0.5, which is what it is here, to 0.4 spreads the highlight out a little bit. And so for something like this rubber plant, that actually seems a little bit more natural. When we look at the shrub back here, we lowered the gloss from 0.5 to 0.2, and you can see 0.2 maybe feels a little low. So here maybe they're a little bit, this highlight's a little too tight maybe on some of these leaves, and yet going down to 0.2, you can see it maybe gets a little too spread out. So that could be compensated by maybe making it a little bit brighter though, as far as the reflectivity with the BRDF curve. And so here is the same thing just with a different light direction. So same exact settings on the shader, just made it a backlit scene. So when we look at this with some of the big broad reflections we're getting on the rubber plant leaves, it does feel like maybe we could benefit from a bump map so that we're not getting, so we get a little breakup on the highlight. And an MIM material supports bump no problem. You could even take your color map that you're using and potentially get away with using that as a bump, which we could try real quick. So if I just go and grab the rubber plant leaf, which is right there, so here's its material, and so if we just go down, let's just close some of these things up, you'll see you have your bump folder. And so you have overall and standard bump. So for this we would just use a standard bump. You also can choose to have no diffuse bump, so the bump only affects the specular, which for something like a plant you wouldn't necessarily need. But if we just go to standard bump for that, we would just go, let's go to Hypershade, map that. We can see here's our texture. Bump is grayscale, so we don't have to worry about gamma correcting it. So if I go and just grab that ramp and drag that into standard bump, it's going to clearly make a bump 2D node. And on that bump 2D node, I could choose and try a very low bump depth, which even that might be too high. Another thing also that's a good idea with pretty much any file texture in Maya is the issue of if we just select this one and close stuff out, your filter type. So filter type by default is quadratic, and under effects, you're going to see that the filter is at 1. So it's blurring your texture quite a bit. Generally what I do is whenever I load file textures into Maya, I always put the filter to 0.1. So you can also turn the filter type off, but for me, putting the filter type to 0.1 tends to work fine. So it makes my texture sharp, but at the same time works well. And if I turn it off, then you can get issues in animation with sizzling textures and stuff like that. So for the rubber plant leaf, I'm just lowering the filter down, and then on the bump map, I've got the bump depth at 0.1, and then if we go back to the render view window, for this we could potentially just go and grab just a region and render that. And wait. Although I should have saved the image prior so we could see the difference. So let me just save this. Let's go back to the rubber plant leaf. Let's go to the bump map that we have. And so for this bump, let's go and find, that's not what I want. It's going into different textures. So let me go and just grab it via hypershade because sometimes that's easier. So this is our rubber plant leaf. Go to the bump node. Just to make things obvious, if I go to the render view window with the bump depth set to 1, and wait. So, and then that's not working. Let me just see what I'm doing funny. All right, got that fixed. So, and there you can see without bump and with bump. So what was happening as far as why it didn't work is rather simple. Basically, this is how things were connected. I had used the ramp into the bump, and that was off. So, meaning alpha is luminance. So the default connection for a bump map out of the ramp you can see is out alpha. And for the ramp, the out alpha is really just a solid white, just a solid color. So that's not giving us information. We don't want the out alpha, we want the color. So what I did is I broke the connection there and used the actual file texture to drive the bump map. And then on the file texture in the attribute editor, so I just set alpha to be luminance. So the out alpha is just the grayscale or luminance of the color. And so in order to derive my bump. So simple little thing that just needed to check. And so now that the bump is working, my bump depth is at 1 right now. And so you can see that it's obviously a little bit strong. So let's say I go and put that down to 0.2. And let's go and grab, let's say, a larger region and render that. And so here we can see the effect is very subtle, but if you look at the highlight that was on this leaf right here, you can see with the bump map, it's just breaking it up a little bit, adding a little bit more variation into that leaf. So clearly for the leaves back here, just based on the angle, a little bit more noticeable, obviously with that bump depth at 1, but the only point is that just like with texturing or shading anything, introducing for something like a leaf, a little bit of a bump, or potentially even a specular map, is going to help. So using the actual RGB, like I'm using here, the color map as the bump, isn't also necessarily the best thing because I might need to sort of modify it or correct it. Because if I want that stem that's coming down the middle of the leaf to bump out a lot more, then clearly that might require me to take this texture and adjust it in Photoshop a little bit, just by adjusting levels to get that line, you know, just to be a little bit brighter than the surrounding texture. All right, but before we get ahead of ourselves and start introducing too many things in here, really it's just a matter of hopefully you now understanding the basics of creating plants with paint effects. So create a library, decide which ones are useful, convert them to polygons, and then basically create new shaders. You can reuse the textures that PaintFX creates if you want, create your own. They're just regular file textures or procedurals. The main thing is plugging them into an MIA material so that we can see that we can get, you know, much better looking plants, just testing them under different lighting conditions, than the way things kind of were looking in the beginning. And if I do go back to a couple of these images, you can see that this is really just a matter of doing the same thing, but to all the different PaintFX brushes that I liked, just to create blocked out shaders. And so in the end, that's pretty much that. So let's go out here. And also, since I've created new shaders for some of these objects, I'm going to end up with the old shaders still sitting around. So I can go and say delete unused nodes, and it's just going to delete the shaders that were previously assigned to these objects, and then the ones that I've created are going to get left. And so slowly I would have to go in and create textures for all of these other groups. But like I mentioned, we could always go in and repurpose some. So if I go and let's say we get something else to be visible inside here. So let's just get everything back on. And let's now turn off our gate. And let's go and organize things a little bit better. So this plant is this guy. So let's move him back into position there. So we've done two of them. And so we can see how, you know, this plant is going to be very, very similar to the settings that I used for this rubber plant. While something like this, which is called rosemary, you'll see that this geometry actually has some thickness to it. And so you wouldn't necessarily need, or you wouldn't need to use the thin option or thin walled. It would be solid if you were going to use translucency on that. So going through all of these to create your library, you know, takes a little bit of time, but the reality is to do all of these, you know, doesn't need to take more than, you know, an hour or two, just because you're going to use one as a start point for the next one. So, and what I mean by that is, let's say we go to this bush. This one here, which is very similar to this one. It's a different leaf texture that's being used, but it's, let's say we want to use the same general start point. So, well, I could go in here and go to Hypershade, and let's take a look at what's mapped onto the branches here for this guy. Again, it's a Fong, but you can see it's the same texture that was applied to the branches of this preset. So really, I could just take that and map it. So there's the MIA material I made for those branches. Select the branches for this guy and just assign that same one. So no real reason to make a new one. But then for these leaves, if I map this, you can see if we look at that leaf, it's like, well, actually that leaf looks like it is the same leaf. And so the difference is that maybe, you know, we have this little stucco pattern on it, but it is actually the same leaf texture that's being used. And so what that means is I really could just use that, map it, select the leaves on this guy, and assign that. And that's pretty much that guy. So I could go in and delete unused, get rid of the things I don't need. And if I wanted this bush to be different than this bush in some way, then I could always just make a copy of this shading network. And so this is called bushes, while this is called shrub. So if I select my bushes here, I'm going to select this shrub shading group, and I can go in and duplicate the shading network. So now I have this copy, which I will go and graph, and I will assign the copy to those leaves, but I will rename it as, let's say, bushes, leaf MIA. And then for this, maybe I don't have the stucco, so maybe they're just a regular green leaf. So now you can see that this guy, if I map it, has an MIA material. And the nice thing about duplicating the shading network is I don't have to go and recreate the gamma node, the reverse node, and whatever. And I could even swap the leaf texture. So if we'd find something in here that does have a different leaf texture, so for example, this guy down here. So that looks like it's not using an alpha though, so let's see if there's something like the ivy there. Okay, so this ivy is a leaf, but using a different leaf texture. And so therefore what I might choose to do is take this network that I have for those bushes, duplicate the shading network, so now I have this guy, which I will map. This is now going to become my ivy leaf. So ivy leaf, MIA. And then I need to find out what leaf texture that is. So for it, it's clearly this one, but if I say select material from objects, that's what it is. Drag that in here. Let's map both of these. So that's the leaf texture that also has a ramp on it. So if I want, I can just use the same file node and just replace what's over here with it. Or I can just go here, select all, copy, and then here, and paste. So now I've got this ivy leaf. So the ramp that's here on the ivy, you can see is adding a little bit more green to it. The ramp I have here is almost the same. It's easy to adjust that ramp if you want to. But you can see how easily I made the texture for the ivy. And so ivy is probably going to be a little shinier than the shrub or the bush leaf. And so that's where I'd be like, well, the glossiness on this I might put up to 0.4. And then in the BRDF, I might put it up to 0.9. So once you get used to these sliders and attributes and what they mean, it gets to be a lot easier to block things out. So then the thing I would have to make that would be new would be the material that would go on the ivy, let's say, vines. So for those, obviously, that's something that is going to be a little bit shinier than anything that I have as far as I just have that bark wood texture. So I'd create a new one for that. I can take a look at what is being used on it right now, and you'll see the texture that Maya created, that PaintFX created, it's a little weird, you know, that it has a texture on it. It really doesn't need it. So the only thing that's interesting is maybe the colors. So what I might choose to do is like, well, I'll maybe use that ramp. So I'm going to get rid of what Maya created there because that's kind of weird. I'll use that ramp. I'll go to Mental Ray. I'll create a new MIA Material X. And then I'm going to use that ramp on here. But I know that I need to gamma correct it. So I'm going to go to Utilities, and I'm going to grab a gamma correct node, drag that into the value, put the gamma to 0.454, and plug that into the diffuse. And then this is going to become my ivy stems, or whatever you want to call them. MIA. And then for that, some basic changes. Reflectivity at 1, glossiness maybe at 0.4, like we used for the palm. Then in here under advanced reflection, so this is thick, it has thickness to it, solid geometry, so skip reflection on inside can be on. If I want it to be translucent, my basic start point in here, transparency 0.25. Also, let's lower the 90-degree reflection to 0.9. Go to translucency, turn it on, put the weight value to 1. And then remember that I need to multiply this. If I'm using a transparency of 0.25, I need to multiply it by 4. So multiply by 4. And then in here, I can grab the multiply divide node and put that into translucency color. So now I have this ramp being used for the color. So if we now just go and graph our MIA material, if I say select objects with material, you can see I don't have anything selected. I haven't assigned it. So select that geometry. assign this material to it. We've got the ramp that Maya created, which we'll probably end up adjusting. These colors aren't very natural for Ivy. Gamma correct it, which goes into diffuse, and then multiply it, which goes into the translucency color. So out here, reflectivity, glossiness, script reflection on inside is on because it's solid. Under refraction, advanced refraction, also set to solid because this is not a thin-walled piece. And then turn on ambient occlusion, and I've got the BRDF set to those values. So relatively quickly to block that out. So as far as whether it looks good, we'd have to do some render tests to check. But if we grab the thing, if we want to just check that real quick, the Ivy mesh group is right there. So let's hide everything other than that. Resolution gate. And do a quick render to see what it looks like. So let's get back to here. And let's render that out. All right, so looks pretty good. So it's clearly the colors that are in the file texture and the ramp that are used are very, very pale yellowy green with very low saturation. So maybe like very, very young Ivy. So when you see Ivy though that has been growing for a while and is a little older, clearly the colors get a lot darker. So that would be the main thing that I would say about this, is just that it looks more like budding plants as opposed to something that's a little bit older, but it still looks pretty good. And again, this was something that was created just by setting some very, very basic sort of initial attribute settings. So we started with one shader, duplicated it, swapped the leaf texture, and you can see the translucency is working on both our thin-walled as well as our solid branches inside here. So that is the Ivy. So now at this point, out of our objects in here, if we make everything visible, and look around, we know that we've now done 4 of them. So if we look inside here, and let's say there's around 20 or 20 more to do, again, it wouldn't really take that much longer to go through it. So it's just a matter of understanding the basics of the MIA material, and really what you're going to want to do is just make a few. Just make a paint effects, convert to poly, make the shader, and just do it over and over again 5 times so you understand how to set the translucency, how to use the gamma correct node if you're using an exposure node, how to use the multiply divide node. So you might need to watch this MIA section a couple times to get it, but it's pretty much everything that you need to know. So there are some other topics with plants that we want to talk about, which we're going to move on to, but for now I'm just going to save this scene and figure out what's next.